Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play ActRaiser 2. In the last part we started off the game and got through the first 3 levels, and now we're going to get quite a bit further. Master, you've done it! Master, the tortoise has risen, freeing those who were imprisoned in stone. I wonder how those people feel after existing for so long in stone. Imagine each day of your life, unable to move or speak, wishing for freedom. I have no desire to see this type of tragedy occur again. Suddenly from the east comes a sad voice rising from the temple on the ocean's floor. Master, shall we go look? Worth noting, 9 out of every 10 levels in this game you can actively see them on the world map even before you access them, but there are a couple you can't see until you get to them. This is a submarine castle where a queen once lived. The demon Jealousy conquered her. The flame of her jealousy still exists. If you wish to defeat this demon, you must extinguish the flame of jealousy. Master, please go to the land and save this country. Worth noting, similar to other games in the era, a lot of the names in this game are slightly censored to be not as religious. Jealousy is actively envy. Hence why the snail boss was Sloth. We're effectively fighting the 7 deadly sins as demons alongside some other minor arcana, so to speak, amongst the sins. I forget if Vanity's in there off the top of my head, I won't lie. Won't lie, when I first played that game, that actively sent a bit of a chill down my spine seeing that head in the background. Which I just didn't talk about that. I mentioned back in my ActRaiser 1 LP that I learned about that game largely through the Clan of the Grey Wolf 16-bit gem series. And by extension, same here with this game, but this is a game I actively approached more out of curiosity after finishing the first game. And, well, I briefly touched on this last time. I like this game less than the first ActRaiser. There's a whole cavalcade of reasons. I actively do miss the sim elements a lot. I don't think the soundtrack's as iconic. I think visually the game is overall better. But in that regard, it's like the original ActRaiser was, I forget if it was an outright launch title or at least launch window adjacent. Meanwhile, here in ActRaiser 2, we're in 1993, so if a team was actively developing for the Super Nintendo regularly, like Quintet was, yeah, they were doing pretty good. And plus, on top of that, 1993, that's what, same years as the original Star Fox was that year. I think Secret of Mana was. I want to say the Super Nintendo of Ys 4, if not Ys 4 in general, was as well. Which actually a little bit of a connecting note there. I'm a lot more well-versed in game history at this point than I was back when I played the original ActRaiser, but also I talk more about, you know, development teams at this point. Quintet, I don't think I talked about this actively, is actively made up of a lot of former Falcom devs that left, I think, after Ys 2 in specific. Future me, check me on my math on that. Which, I won't lie, especially as that company's become one of my favorites more and more as time's passed. Does kind of feel like they were always just kind of lurking behind a corner with a baseball bat, ready for me to just kind of get really into the things they do. If it wasn't me just kind of liking early Ys games like Ys 3 on my relatively early emulation days and all that, it was Trails waiting to just absorb my brain as I constantly theorize about it with specific friends. So, the temple at Altheria here, similarly to the previous stage, there's water visuals on screen at all times, but it actively never impacts your controls. It's just a visual flavoring thing, on top of them theming the enemies around it. Most of the stage isn't too bad, but there are a couple of relatively blind falls that you don't know what's going to be below you with. With that said, the double jump into float can help you a lot with that. The worst part of this stage at large was a jump we did a few moments ago where you need to do a pretty precise double jump glide to get through a relatively thin passageway. It doesn't look as precise as it is, but trust me, it really is, because the arc of the double jump and how the glide works is really specific. Plus, there's the factor below you when you do that jump is spikes. And spikes in this game, with a couple of very minor exceptions that aren't technically spikes, are instant kill. So watch out. If you're a Mega Man fan, your spike phobia will come into real play here. And on this screen, we just need to bat the head away as we slowly approach the boss fight against Envy themselves. This is a bit of a weird fight in that the head that we've seen, which I think is technically part of Envy overall, will try to circle around the room and get closer to you with heads that'll cycle inwards. But your target is both that head and the fire in the center. The Raging Bomb is really good because you can get a lot of hits here pretty quickly. I think you can just outwardly just kill this boss by attacking the head, but it takes a while because I think the head takes less damage until all of the smaller heads it generates are destroyed, but at the end of the day, it's far from the worst. I'd ultimately say, barring the one jump with the specific glide, this is where the game's easy stages end at large, as coming forward, we're going to start having a lot of very crowded areas. Master, you've done it. The flame is gone. The demon has been defeated. Look! The land is returning. Let's take a look at the town while we're here. One day, the queen who ruled this land became extremely jealous. She became suspicious of the man she loved, and she felt the land was too small. Soon she grew jealous of every beautiful thing in the world. Then she lost everything, including herself. Jealousy is a terrible demon. We must stop people from making this mistake. A man from Temponia, located in the south, came to ask for our help. I'm afraid something may be happening in Temponia. Master, shall we go look? It's not as major because you're not as actively influencing it via the simulation sections as much, but I do like that the world at least still slightly updates as you progress through levels like that. Temponia used to be known for its great abundance of food. The demon Gluttony entered the city and devoured everything. Soon people began to starve and fight with one another. Ghouls began attacking travelers in Modero, the nearby desert. Master, would you like to visit Modero? We may find some answers there. I mean, hey, why not? I mean, there's only so many places we can visit in the world at the moment. What do we got? The desert has become horrible. People who have passed away due to starvation have been turned into ghouls by the demon. The giant mouths towards the sky are part of the demon. There are many cliffs here, and we are unsure of what is beneath. Please be careful when jumping off of them. So, fun fact, I mentioned before that you can do the levels in pretty much any order as long as you do an Act 1 before an Act 2. When I first played the game, this was the first level I did, and that may have been a mistake, honestly. So Modero was ultimately at its most dangerous in its final chunk, but not for nothing, there's a lot of damage you can take here really quickly. Specifically from the ghouls the angel just brought up, which are not your standard type of ghoul that you might think of that's like a zombie adjacent thing. It's more like what if an antlion pit was a mouth in and of itself, like right there. That giant Sarlacc pit thankfully isn't an instant kill, but it does do, I believe, a full 4 units of health up on our health bar, and considering each one is active with 2 health points, it's 8 total damage from one specific thing. Yeah, they're pretty punishing. With that said, they're not the hardest to get over in most cases. There's one pit that's a little bit longer than the rest that can be a little tight, but if you just fly over most of the level like this, you can really ignore a lot of that. I want to say doing that, if you time it just right, you can actively skip all the way towards the mini-boss of this stage, or at least directly before it. Worth noting about these enemies that weirdly remind me of something from Die Ranger, by the way. One of the Gormons specifically. They are technically 2 enemies at once when they're standing up. You can either destroy the top half or the lower half. If you destroy the bottom half, I believe it just tries to move further into an attack like that, but if you destroy just the top half, you get legs that run around, and upon death, they actually explode into some shrapnel, so if you're not careful, you might take some excess damage from that. With that said, you can just stun lock them with your sword pretty easily and destroy the legs first. So mini-boss for this stage is a vulture who has 2 attacks, either a spread of 2 bullets that it tries to aim into you, or a swipe across the screen. For moments like this, a really good option is the just standard dive attack the Master has, where you do a double jump, immediately hold down on the attack button, and then just dive through enemies. As not only does it do a good amount of damage, something about its rate of movement, something about how enemies move in this game, something about how the hitboxes work, you're likely to actively clip through certain enemy hitboxes or even certain attacks in doing so. In fact, I want to say, and this is me digging out memories from a Games Done Quick event years ago, the dive attack is actively used to do some out-of-bounds tricks, I want to say? So this is where this level truly becomes a pain in the ass. The rest of Modero is an elevator section. We have a lot more ghouls placed on the wall who rhythmically fire out fireballs, and we're going to have a lot of spikes below us as well. What makes this section so rough is that you have very little time to actively react to what's below you, as the rate of movement is just high enough where you're either going to try and just eat a hit to avoid some other larger damage, like a hit from the fireballs to avoid a hit from the spikes. And it just doesn't feel great. With that said, this is actively a very good opportunity to use the dive strike that the Master has with Alkaliding, where you just kind of hold your sword downwards, as that can clip below the platform and kill the ghouls before you get too close to them. Similarly to the other dive attack, the downward stab is also really good for kind of just clipping through certain enemy hitboxes in the case you're getting into some tight straights. Once you reach the bottom of this shaft, you're going to be in the boss fight, and I'm going to start talking about the boss fight now because it's actively not on screen for very long, as it's very easy to get a pretty quick kill on it. The boss of this stage is called Hunger, I believe. It's a giant version of one of the golems that we've seen earlier in the stage. In fact, you can even spawn them in as an attack. It'll spawn out some eyeballs that can circle around it as a shield, but your main goal is to just hit its eyeball in the center of its sprite relatively. With that said, they use some Mode 7 adjacent sprite resizing here, and because of that, reading where the hitboxes can be a little bit awkward. The Raging Bomb is still a very good option here, though, as you can see, on top of the Fire Breath, as you can just melt through the health pretty quickly. It's not a very dangerous fight, but you do have to keep in mind the blood water below you that'll actively damage you if you touch it. I don't think it's instant kill, but I'd stay away from it all the same, just in case. And that's Modero out of the way, already halfway done with our third region. With that said, unfortunately, the second half of this region arguably is one of the worst stages in the game, mostly for the boss fight more than anything. What do the angels got to say about this? Master, you've done it. The people who have passed away from starvation may rest now. Shall we return to the city? We've recovered a little bit in the desert. A large army of ants living in the cave northwest of here often attacks the city, stealing all of the food. People have started rioting in search of food. Hunger is one of the strongest desires a human being may feel. I believe it is difficult for them to control. Master, you must go to the cave and destroy the ants. Time for the honestly aptly named Demon's Cave. It looks like the demon Gluttony is hiding here. The pathway inside is very confusing and narrow. Be careful. Worth noting, if you have any insect or arachnid-related phobias, you might want to not watch this level. So, they're right about this being a pretty tight level, but not for nothing. The later you get into this game, the more they really challenge your knowledge of the Master's jumping arc and flight and all that. And one of the ways they do that, similarly to certain Kirby games, is by having the later levels get a lot more tight and narrow. So there's not as much room for you to just fly over the level and all that. Usually if you can do that in a level, it's going to be in the Act 1 of a world, so to speak, rather than a Act 2. Mind you, that comparison has its own share of flaws, as Kirby's flight is, well, flight. You can ascend. Meanwhile, the Master's glide is that. It's a glide. You're always subject to gravity and always falling downward. So there's inherently much more of a learning curve to how to use it to begin with. Similarly to the Altheria stage, there's going to be several times where you have to do small jumps over spikes and all that, and those are still instant kill, and these don't feel great still. One thing I will say is that the game is definitely a bit generous when it comes to item pickups. Not so much in their pacing, but more what's in them. Usually if a level is full of a lot more enemies, or they know you're going to take a lot more damage in it, an item container that you go out of the way to get might actively have more often a 5 health recovery or a 10 health recovery than, say, a 2 or an MP. Arachnophobia warning. So these weird, spider goblins, I guess, don't actively have an attack outside of just crawling in either direction to try and do contact damage to you. What I personally find annoying about them is the way some of them are placed, specifically when they're close to spikes like this, as you need to precariously dangle most of your sprite over the spikes to actively hit them with your sword, and it's just not very comfortable feeling in the cases you have to do that. The Fire Breath spell is very good at hitting them long distance, of course, because it has wider range, but I prefer not to use that on standard enemies, as that feels almost like a waste of MP. Because every spell in this game has some good uses, especially the 2 or 3 I tend to use a lot of in mini-bosses and bosses. But you get so little MP guaranteed at any given stage, where I'd rather just save it. Because as we've seen thus far in the LP already, a Raging Bomb or 2 can easily take any given boss fight down below 2/3 of their health, and from there, I either just need to place some good pot shots with my sword, or I could just maybe even take a Pyrrhic approach to the fight, and just take some hits along the way as long as I'm doing more damage to them, and it usually works out. I like to think I know this game decently well, but there are people who are definitely a lot more skillful than me at it. Hi, PJ Desicare, alongside several other speedrunners, for instance, but also just people who grew up playing this game a lot more. I think at most I've played ActRaiser 2 at this point maybe 4 or 5 times. Meanwhile, I've played the original game well over 10, easily. And it's largely just a thing of taste at that point, but also, with the exception of specific boss fights towards the end game where you want to spam like the Meteor spell in ActRaiser 1, I think ActRaiser 1 is also just the more approachable game to play because of how its stage difficulty curves tend to feel. So while we wade through the rest of this stage until we get to the Gluttony boss fight, let's talk about this game's manual, specifically the prologue, and it actively does have descriptions for every single region in the game within it. The prologue is pretty familiar though to the opening crawl we heard from the first angel we talked to. Defeated, Tanjiro lies upon the ground in front of you. As he tries to breathe, the air seems to escape his body in shallow, short gasps. His demons, themselves defeated, can only watch as their fallen lord struggles for life. Finally, the chest of their leader rises no more, which is funny because that chest is just a heart and a skeleton. From underneath the mist rise large, dark, hooded figures. These are the demons which even you have only heard about, the Chosen 13, Tandra's mightiest demons. With great care, these demons transport their king back to the underworld from which they came. Because of your victory in this great battle, people have been able to live in peace for several thousand years. Now something has happened. Through their combined power, the Chosen 13 have raised the evil lord. Tandra, now alive, has vowed revenge on you and your people. He has sent forth the Chosen to destroy everything. Which is sort of, I guess, the point of the little intro demo they have, where if you leave the game on the title screen running enough, it plays that sequence I showed off last time where the Master goes down and actually fights an upgraded version of Tandra's sprite from the end of ActRaiser 1, which we might actively see again later on, call it a hunch. After the plot synopsis, the game gives a screenshot for Act 1 and 2 of every region, as well as a little synopsis of the area's minor plot. For instance, over in Diligence, back in Stage 1, this is a very beautiful country covered in rivers and forests. In former times, the people here worked hard at keeping their land healthy. Not long ago, a bizarre storm struck this country. People seem to have been affected by the rainfall, no longer desiring to live or much less work. And they'll just do one for each one from there, which I'll cover the rest of those starting in Part 3. Because once we get over these spikes, it's time for the Gluttony boss fight. Gluttony starts the fight attached to the ceiling and will occasionally just lunge at you, while other spawn will fall from the ceiling and either crawl along the ground or fly at you, which can make it pretty busy to begin with. But around the halfway point of their health bar, they fall off the ceiling and then just try to walk into you, jumping heavily at you or lunging their tail at you. The jumps in specific are large enough due to the size of the sprite and the size of the room where it's very easy to get cornered and take a lot of damage very quickly, especially on higher difficulties. Largely, I'm playing this game on normal mode, worth noting, because the game doesn't change anything on hard mode. At least as far as I'm aware, barring one exception tied to a password I'll show off down the line. But worth noting, on hard mode, I believe Gluttony does a full 4 pips of your health at a time per hit, so 8 damage. Yeah, that's a little bit strict. Especially for as early in the game as we still are. Master, you've done it! Finally, this land has been freed from this demon. Shall we return to the city? Alright, let's see how things are ending up here in Temponia. The rioting has stopped. Life for these people has returned to normal. They seem to have changed slightly. Once people grow used to a life of extravagance, they tend to forget the most important things in their lives. They seem to understand this now. Master, the color of the sky in the northwest is red like fire. I'm afraid something has happened. We must investigate. Alright, time for us to finally head over towards the northwestern continent in the world map, which is noticeably different than it was in ActRaiser 1, but again, several thousand years have passed, so Welcome to Justania. Justania is famous for its army. The king, having been invaded by a demon, forced his army to attack Favorian. Day by day, the numbers of victims increased. Master, let us go to the Death Field and stop this war. I feel like Deathfield might be one of the most upfront names I've ever read for a level. This is Deathfield. Justania and Favorian are at war. The king of Justania built a fort in the field from where he attacked Favorian. The king is being controlled by a demon. He has no heart. We should place him in a deep sleep before he causes any more damage. Yeah, deep sleep, that's what we're going to do to him, right? But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're heading into Deathfield. See you guys then.